They didn't call her a coward because she failed. They called her a coward because she refused to rush. While others chased action and approval, she stayed behind, reading reports, questioning routes, flagging risks no one wanted to hear about. They laughed. They dismissed her. They decided caution meant fear. Then convoys started breaking down. Then radios went silent. Then lives almost didn't come back. She never raised her voice, never defended herself, never said, "I warned you." She just kept working. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with silence. From wherever you're watching, let us know in the comments. And if this story has earned you respect, click like so others can find it too. The dust settled across Forward Operating Base Crescent like a blanket, fine and relentless, coating every surface in a layer of pale brown that no amount of cleaning could permanently remove. Sergeant Rachel Kern stood at the edge of the motor pool, clipboard pressed against her chest, watching a convoy prepare for departure. Her boots were worn but clean, her uniform properly pressed despite the conditions. She was 31 years old, assigned to convoy operations coordination, a role that placed her between the infantry units who executed missions and the command staff who authorized them. It was a position that required precision, patience, and the ability to absorb criticism from both directions without flinching. She had learned to do all three exceptionally well. The convoy lined up in standard formation, 5 vehicles, 12 soldiers. Lieutenant Carver stood near the lead Humvee, gesturing broadly as he briefed his team. He was 24, fresh from officer candidate school, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything that mattered. Rachel had reviewed his route plan that morning. She had flagged 3 concerns in her report. All 3 had been dismissed. Carver had told her during the briefing that she worried too much, that hesitation was worse than action, that a soldier who second-guessed every decision would never accomplish anything. The other soldiers had nodded along. A few had smirked. Rachel had said nothing in response. She had simply marked her report as submitted and moved on to the next task. Now, as the convoy prepared to roll out, she stood in the same spot she always occupied during departures, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unnoticed. Carver saw her watching and called out across the motor pool, "Don't worry, Kern, we'll bring your precious trucks back in one piece." Laughter rippled through the soldiers near him. Rachel didn't react. She just adjusted her grip on the clipboard and continued her visual inspection of the vehicles. One of the gunners, a corporal named Hayes, leaned over the side of his turret. "Maybe she's scared we won't make it back. That it, Kern? You afraid of a little danger?" More laughter. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her expression remained neutral. She had heard worse. She had endured worse. Silence had become her most reliable defense. The word had started weeks earlier, though Rachel couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it attached itself to her. Coward. It began as an undercurrent, whispered in passing, muttered just loud enough for her to hear but never loud enough to confront directly. It spread through the barracks, the chow hall, the operations center. Soldiers who had never spoken to her felt entitled to judge her. She didn't volunteer for patrols outside the wire. She didn't push for combat assignments. She asked too many questions during mission briefs. She flagged risks that others dismissed as paranoia. To the infantry soldiers, this made her suspect. To the officers eager to prove themselves, it made her an obstacle. To everyone else, it made her irrelevant. Rachel knew what they thought. She could see it in the way they avoided eye contact when she entered a room, in the way conversations quieted when she approached, in the way her input during briefings was acknowledged with polite nods and then ignored entirely. She had tried, in the beginning, to explain her reasoning. She had presented data, historical precedents, documented failure points. It hadn't mattered. The culture of the FOB rewarded boldness, decisiveness, action. Caution was seen as weakness. Thoroughness was seen as fear. Rachel had learned to stop explaining. She had learned to submit her reports, document her concerns, and let the record speak for itself. It never did. The convoy departed at 0800 hours. Rachel watched the vehicles disappear into the haze of heat and dust, then returned to her workspace. Her desk was located in a corner of the operations center. positioned in a way that suggested both necessity and dismissal. She was needed for the paperwork, the logistics, the endless stream of administrative requirements that kept the FOB functional, but she wasn't needed for the decisions. Those belonged to others. Rachel didn't mind the isolation. It gave her time to work without interruption, to review mission reports, to analyze patterns that others overlooked. She had noticed, over the past month, a troubling trend in convoy routes. 3 different units had reported minor equipment failures along the same stretch of highway. Nothing catastrophic, but consistent. Electrical malfunctions, communication dropouts, unusual wear on specific vehicle components. Each report had been filed and forgotten. Rachel had pulled them all together and submitted a consolidated analysis to the operations officer. She had recommended a temporary route adjustment until maintenance could conduct a thorough investigation. The recommendation had been rejected. The operations officer had told her that changing established routes based on minor technical glitches would signal weakness to the local population, that insurgents would interpret caution as vulnerability. Rachel had asked if it might be worth investigating whether the technical glitches were actually technical. The operations officer had stared at her for a long moment, then told her to focus on her assigned duties and leave tactical assessments to the combat arms personnel. The meeting had ended there. Rachel had returned to her desk, updated her files, and said nothing further. She had learned that persistence was often mistaken for insubordination. The convoy was scheduled to return by 1400 hours. At 13:30, Rachel began her standard pre-arrival checklist. She verified that the maintenance bay was clear, that medical personnel were notified of the return time, that the next shift of guards was prepared for the gate security protocols. At 13:55, the radio crackled. The convoy was 5 minutes out. Rachel walked back to the motor pool and resumed her position at the edge of the yard. The vehicles appeared through the gate, slower than they had left, covered in more dust, but intact. Carver climbed out of the lead Humvee, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through sweat-soaked hair. He saw Rachel and grinned. "See? All in one piece. Just like I promised." Rachel nodded once, then began her post-mission inspection. She walked the length of each vehicle, checking tie-downs, fuel levels, visible damage. Most soldiers ignored her. A few made comments as she passed. "Surprised we made it back. Kern, bet you were holding your breath the whole time. Must be disappointing when nothing goes wrong." Rachel didn't respond. She finished her inspection, noted 2 minor issues that would require maintenance attention, and returned to the operations center to file her report. Later that evening, she sat alone in the chow hall, as she always did. Her tray held the same meal as everyone else, but the table around her remained empty. Soldiers filled the other seats, talking, laughing, reliving the day's events. Rachel ate in silence, chewing slowly, thinking about the route analysis she had submitted and the pattern of failures that no one else seemed to find concerning. She thought about the word that followed her everywhere now, the label that had become her identity in the eyes of nearly everyone on the base. Coward. She thought about whether it bothered her. She decided it didn't, not because the judgment didn't sting, but because she knew something they didn't. She knew that being right and being respected were not the same thing. She knew that survival often depended on the decisions no one wanted to make. And she knew that the loudest voices were rarely the most competent ones. 3 days later, another convoy was scheduled. Different personnel, same route. Rachel reviewed the mission brief and felt the familiar tension settle in her chest. She pulled up her previous reports, reread her analysis, and confirmed that nothing had changed. The pattern was still there, the equipment failures were still happening, the route was still being used. She drafted a new memo, more direct this time, outlining specific kilometer markers where issues had occurred and recommending either a route change or a full engineering sweep of the area. She submitted it to the operations officer. 2 hours later, she was called into his office. He didn't ask her to sit. "Kern," he said, not looking up from his computer, "I need you to understand something. Your job is convoy coordination. That means paperwork, vehicle assignments, and scheduling. It does not mean strategic planning. It does not mean threat assessment. We have intelligence personnel for that. We have combat commanders for that. What we need from you is to keep the convoys organized and stop trying to redesign our entire operational approach based on your personal anxieties. Rachel stood perfectly still. Sir, I'm not suggesting a redesign. I'm identifying a pattern of mechanical failures that may indicate what, Sergeant? That you've found something our engineers, our intelligence analysts, and our combat veterans have all missed. Or that you're looking for reasons to justify your own reluctance to accept operational realities. The silence that followed was heavy. Rachel knew the answer he wanted. She also knew the answer she could give. They were not the same. Understood, sir, she said quietly. Good. Dismissed. Rachel left the office and returned to her desk. She opened her file system and created a new folder. She labeled it with the date and the route designation. Then she copied every report, every analysis, every communication she had submitted regarding the convoy route. She saved it all in one place, organized chronologically, and backed it up to a secure drive. She didn't know if anyone would ever look at it. She didn't know if it would matter, but she knew that when things went wrong, and she believed they would, the record would exist. That was all she could do. Document. Submit. Wait. The convoy rolled out the next morning. Rachel wasn't assigned to observe this one, but she walked to the motor pool anyway. She stood in her usual spot and watched the vehicles line up. The soldiers preparing to leave were younger than Carver's group, less experienced, louder in their bravado. Their platoon sergeant, a man named Kowalski, noticed her watching. Something wrong, Kern? He called out. No, Sergeant, she replied. Just conducting pre-departure observation. We don't need a babysitter. Understood. She stayed anyway. Kowalski shook his head and turned back to his men, muttering something Rachel couldn't hear. Whatever it was made the soldiers near him laugh. Rachel didn't move. She watched the convoy complete its pre-departure checks, watched the gunners settle into their positions, watched the vehicles rumble toward the gate, and then she returned to her desk and waited. The call came at 1100 hours. The convoy had gone silent. No radio contact for 20 minutes. Last known position along the route Rachel had flagged. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Officers barked orders. Communication specialists worked their radios. Maps were pulled up on screens. Rachel stood at the edge of the room, unnoticed, her hands clasped behind her back. She listened to every transmission, tracked every update, and felt the cold certainty settle into her bones. This was it. This was what she had tried to prevent. At 11:30, contact was re-established. The convoy had experienced multiple simultaneous electrical failures. Navigation systems, communications, even basic engine controls had malfunctioned within seconds of each other. The vehicles had been dead in the water, vulnerable, unable to move or call for help. Only the quick thinking of one of the drivers, who had manually bypassed the electrical system using a procedure from a training exercise years earlier, had restored enough function to get them moving again. They were returning to base. No casualties, no enemy contact, just equipment failure. Catastrophic, synchronized, exactly as Rachel had predicted. The operations officer stood in the center of the room, staring at the map on the screen. How the hell did that happen? He said to no one in particular. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't move. She simply stood there, waiting to see if anyone would remember her reports. No one did. The debrief happened an hour later. Kowalski and his team described the failures in detail. Engineers were summoned. Maintenance personnel were questioned. Theories were proposed. Electrical interference, equipment age, environmental factors. Rachel sat in the back of the room taking notes. When the operations officer asked if anyone had additional input, she raised her hand. Yes, Kern. Sir, I submitted 3 reports over the past month documenting similar failures along this route. The pattern suggested either environmental interference or deliberate disruption. I recommended a route change pending investigation. The room went quiet. The operations officer's expression didn't change. Your recommendations were noted, he said. But this appears to be a mechanical issue, not a tactical one. Sir, synchronized failures across multiple vehicles suggests external causation, not random mechanical breakdown. Are you an engineer, Sergeant? No, sir. Then let's leave the technical assessment to those who are. The meeting continued. Rachel's input was not discussed further. She returned to her desk, opened her backup files, and added the incident report to her documentation. Then she sat back and stared at the screen. She had been right. She had documented it. She had warned them. And it had changed nothing. That night, Rachel didn't go to the chow hall. She stayed at her desk, reviewing data, cross-referencing reports, building a more comprehensive analysis than she had attempted before. She worked through the evening meal, through the shift change, through the dimming of lights as the fob settled into its nighttime routine. She was still working when Kowalski appeared at her desk. She looked up, surprised. He was out of uniform, wearing a plain t-shirt and cargo pants, his expression unreadable. "Kern," he said. "Sergeant, you tried to warn us about that route." It wasn't a question. Rachel nodded slowly. "I submitted reports. They were reviewed and dismissed." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. "I read your analysis after we got back, pulled it from the archive. You weren't guessing. You had data." "Yes, Sergeant." "Why didn't you push harder?" Rachel looked at him steadily. "I did push. I was told to stay in my lane." Kowalski rubbed his jaw, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I bet you were." He stood up, pushed the chair back. "For what it's worth, you were right. I don't know if anyone else will say that, but you were right." He walked away before Rachel could respond. She sat alone in the quiet operations center, Kowalski's words echoing in her mind. One person, one acknowledgement. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't justice. But it was something. The following week, another convoy was scheduled. Different route this time, avoiding the problematic stretch of highway entirely. Rachel noted the change in the mission brief but said nothing. The engineers had completed their investigation and determined that the electrical failures were likely caused by environmental electromagnetic interference, possibly natural, possibly enhanced by local terrain features. The route was officially redesignated as requiring additional precautions. Rachel's reports were not mentioned in the official findings. Her name did not appear in the incident summary. The pattern she had identified was attributed to standard engineering analysis conducted after the failure. She didn't protest. She didn't demand credit. She simply updated her files and moved on to the next task. But something had shifted. Not in the way people treated her, not in the way officers responded to her input, but in the way a few soldiers looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Kowalski wasn't the only one who had read her reports. Word had spread quietly through certain channels that Kern had flagged the route before the failure, that her warnings had been ignored, that she had been right. It didn't change the culture of the FOB. It didn't erase the label that followed her. But it created a small pocket of doubt in the minds of those who had been quickest to judge. 2 weeks later, Rachel was assigned to coordinate a supply convoy to an outlying checkpoint. It was routine work, low risk, the kind of mission that required more patience than courage. She prepared the route plan, coordinated with the transport unit, and submitted her brief. The convoy commander was a staff sergeant named Ortiz, a veteran with 3 deployments and a reputation for efficiency. He reviewed Rachel's plan without comment, approved it, and began his preparations. The morning of the departure, Ortiz found Rachel in the motor pool. "Kern," he said, "I want you on this convoy." Rachel looked up from her clipboard. "Sir, I'm not assigned to. I'm assigning you now. I want someone who actually reads the reports riding in the command vehicle." Rachel hesitated. Convoy duty outside the wire wasn't her standard assignment. She coordinated from the FOB, managed logistics, tracked movements. She didn't ride along. "Respectfully, sir, I'm not combat arms. I'm not trained for—" "You're trained for observation and analysis. That's what I need. Gear up." Rachel didn't argue further. She returned to her quarters, put on her full protective equipment, and reported to the convoy staging area. The other soldiers watched her with mixed expressions, some curious, some skeptical, some openly amused. "Look who decided to join us," one of them said. "Why aren't Kern finally going outside the wire?" "Guess she ran out of excuses," another added. Rachel ignored them. She climbed into the command Humvee and took her seat behind Ortiz. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You good?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's move." The convoy rolled out into the pale morning light, leaving the security of the FOB behind. Rachel sat quietly in the back seat, her hands resting on her rifle. her eyes scanning the landscape through the armored window. The terrain was flat and featureless, broken only by occasional clusters of buildings and the thin ribbon of road cutting through the dust. The radio crackled with routine updates. Vehicle spacing was good. Speed was steady. No unusual activity reported by the lead scout. Rachel listened to everything, absorbing the rhythm of the convoy, the small communications that kept 12 soldiers and 4 vehicles moving in coordination. Ortiz drove with calm precision, his eyes constantly moving between the road, his mirrors, and the horizon. After 20 minutes, he spoke without looking back. "You flagged the electrical interference route." "Yes, sir." "Before it failed." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't they listen?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I'm not the right rank to be listened to, sir." Ortiz grunted. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." "Yes, sir." They drove in silence for another 10 minutes. Then Ortiz slowed the convoy. "Something wrong, sir?" Rachel asked. "No, just checking." He picked up the radio. "All vehicles, halt for visual inspection. Maintain spacing and security." The convoy stopped. Ortiz climbed out. Rachel followed without being asked. They walked the length of the convoy together, Ortiz checking each vehicle, Rachel observing. Everything appeared normal. Ortiz stood at the rear vehicle, scanning the road ahead, then turned back toward the command Humvee. "What do you see, Kern?" Rachel looked around carefully. The road, the terrain, the buildings in the distance. Nothing stood out as immediately wrong, but something felt off. The rhythm was too quiet. "I'm not sure, sir." "Neither am I. But my gut says we wait 5 minutes before we keep moving." They waited. The soldiers in the vehicles grew restless, but Ortiz didn't move. He just stood beside the convoy, arms crossed, watching the horizon. At the 4-minute mark, a local vehicle appeared on the road ahead. It was moving fast, too fast for the conditions. Ortiz raised his hand, signaling the convoy to stay put. The vehicle approached, then swerved suddenly off the road and stopped about 200 meters ahead. The driver got out and began waving frantically. "Could be a distress signal," one of the soldiers said. "Could be," Ortiz replied. "Or it could be bait." He turned to Rachel. "What do you think?" Rachel studied the situation. The vehicle's position, the driver's behavior, the empty road, the timing. "I think we don't approach until we've observed longer," she said quietly. Ortiz nodded. "Agreed." They waited another 3 minutes. The driver continued waving, but made no move to approach the convoy. Then, from a building 200 meters past the stopped vehicle, another figure emerged and began walking toward the driver. They spoke briefly. The driver got back in his vehicle and drove away. The second figure disappeared back into the building. Ortiz exhaled slowly. "Could have been nothing." "Could have been," Rachel agreed. "But we didn't need to find out the hard way." Ortiz looked at her for a long moment. "You always this cautious?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get back in the vehicle." The convoy resumed movement. They completed the supply delivery without incident and returned to the phobie by early afternoon. Rachel climbed out of the Humvee, her legs stiff from the journey, and began her standard post-mission tasks. Ortiz stopped her before she could walk away. "Kern." "Sir?" "You did good work today." Rachel didn't know how to respond. "Thank you, sir. I'm going to recommend you for more convoy assignments. We need people who think before they act." "Understood, sir." Ortiz nodded and walked toward the operations center. Rachel stood alone in the motor pool, processing what had just happened. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't an apology for the weeks of dismissal and mockery, but it was recognition. Quiet, professional, real. That evening, Rachel returned to the chow hall. She took her usual seat at the empty table and began eating. Halfway through her meal, Ortiz sat down across from her. Then Kowalski joined them, then 2 other soldiers from the convoy. They didn't make a show of it. They didn't announce anything. They just sat down and ate their meals in companionable silence. Rachel looked up, surprised. Ortiz shrugged. Table looked empty. The meal continued. Conversation was minimal, focused on practical matters, the kind of talk that came naturally to people who worked together. Rachel contributed when asked, listened when she wasn't, and for the first time since arriving at Phobie Crescent, she didn't eat alone. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Word spread that Ortiz had taken Kern outside the wire, that she had performed well, that her caution had been useful rather than cowardly. It didn't erase the label entirely, but it complicated it. Soldiers who had been quickest to mock her now hesitated before making comments. Officers who had dismissed her reports began reading them more carefully. Rachel didn't change her approach. She continued submitting detailed analyses, flagging potential risks, recommending precautions that others found excessive. But now, occasionally, those recommendations were acknowledged. Sometimes they were even implemented. The convoy assignments increased. Ortiz requested her specifically for routes he considered high risk. Other commanders began doing the same. Rachel found herself outside the wire more often, riding in command vehicles, observing terrain, identifying patterns that others missed. She didn't seek these assignments. She didn't volunteer. But when asked, she never refused. Each mission reinforced the same lesson. Caution wasn't cowardice. Thoroughness wasn't weakness. And the soldiers who survived the longest were often the ones who thought before they acted. 6 weeks after the electrical failure incident, Lieutenant Carver returned from leave. He had been gone during the route investigation, the convoy assignments, the quiet shift in how certain soldiers viewed Rachel Kern. He walked into the operations center on his first day back and saw Rachel sitting at her desk, reviewing mission reports. "Still here, Kern," he called out. "Thought you might have transferred to a nice safe job in the rear by now." The room went quiet. Rachel looked up from her work. "Still here, sir." Carver grinned, expecting the usual response. Silence, downcast eyes, the acceptance of his mockery. Instead, Ortiz stood up from his desk on the other side of the room. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "Sergeant Kern has been conducting convoy operations for the past month. She's been outside the wire more than most of your platoon." Carver's grin faded. "I wasn't aware of that. Now you are." The conversation ended there. Carver looked between Ortiz and Rachel, clearly trying to recalibrate, then turned and walked to his own workspace without another word. Rachel returned to her reports. Ortiz caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back. No words were necessary. The largest test came 3 months after Rachel's first convoy with Ortiz. A battalion-level operation was being planned. A coordinated movement of multiple units through contested terrain to establish a new patrol base. The operation required complex logistics, precise timing, and careful route selection. Rachel was assigned to the planning team, a role that would have been unthinkable months earlier. She sat in the briefing room with officers, senior NCOs, and intelligence analysts, listening as the initial plan was presented. The proposed route was direct, efficient, and in Rachel's assessment, catastrophically flawed. It cut through terrain that showed the same electromagnetic signature patterns she had identified in the earlier convoy failures. It relied on vehicle spacing that was too tight for rapid response to contact, and it assumed enemy activity would follow historical patterns rather than adapting to changed coalition tactics. Rachel waited until the briefing was complete, then raised her hand. The operations officer, a major she had never worked with directly, acknowledged her. "Yes, Sergeant Kern. Sir, I have concerns about the primary route." The room's attention shifted to her. Rachel felt the weight of every eye, the unspoken question about whether a logistics sergeant had the standing to challenge a battalion-level operation. She ignored the pressure and continued. The terrain along kilometers 15 through 23 shows similar electromagnetic characteristics to the route where we experienced synchronized vehicle failures 3 months ago. I recommend either an alternate route or enhanced electronic countermeasures. The major looked at the map, then back at Rachel. "Your recommendation is noted. However, the alternate routes add significant time and distance to the operation. The tactical advantage of the direct approach outweighs the potential technical risks." Rachel nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. I'd like to submit a formal analysis for the record." "You're welcome to do that." The briefing continued. Rachel took notes, identified additional concerns, and remained silent for the rest of the meeting. Afterward, she returned to her desk and spent the next 6 hours building the most comprehensive risk assessment she had ever produced. She documented every pattern, every failure point, every historical precedent. She included technical specifications, terrain analysis, and alternative route proposals. When she finished, the document was 40 pages long. She submitted it to the operations officer and copied every member of the planning team. The response came the next morning. The major called her into his office. Rachel reported as ordered, standing at attention. "Sergeant Kern," the major said, "I read your analysis." "Yes, sir. It's thorough." "Thank you, sir. It's also, in my opinion, overly cautious to the point of being operationally limiting." Rachel didn't respond. The major leaned back in his chair. "However, I'm not going to ignore it. I'm bringing in an outside engineering team to conduct an independent assessment of the route. If they confirm your concerns, we'll adjust the plan. If they don't, we proceed as briefed." "Fair." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Rachel left the office with the same steady composure she always maintained. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time, her analysis hadn't been dismissed out of hand. It had been challenged, yes, questioned, certainly, but also taken seriously enough to warrant independent verification. The engineering team arrived 2 days later. They spent a week surveying the route, conducting electromagnetic testing, analyzing vehicle performance data. Rachel wasn't included in their assessment, but she tracked their movements, noted their methodology, and waited. The results came back on day 8. Electromagnetic interference was confirmed along 3 separate sections of the proposed route. The interference was strong enough to potentially disrupt vehicle electronics, communications, and navigation systems. The engineers recommended either route modification or deployment of enhanced countermeasures. The operation was delayed by 72 hours while a new route was planned. Rachel's alternative proposal was adopted with minor modifications. The operation proceeded successfully with no equipment failures and no casualties. No one thanked Rachel. No announcement was made crediting her analysis. The official after-action report attributed the route change to standard engineering assessment protocols. But in the operations center, among the soldiers who had been part of the planning team, among the officers who had read her 40-page analysis, and the engineers who had confirmed her findings, something had changed. Rachel Kern was no longer just the overly cautious logistics sergeant who asked too many questions. She was the person who had prevented a battalion-level failure, the word that had followed her for months, the label that had defined her in the eyes of nearly everyone on the FOB, began to crack. Not because anyone explicitly retracted it, but because reality had quietly disproven it. Coward. The accusation had been based on the assumption that caution equaled fear, that thoroughness meant weakness, that anyone who didn't rush toward action must be running from it. But Rachel had never been running. She had been calculating. She had been analyzing. She had been doing the quiet, unglamorous work that prevented disasters before they happened. And now, finally, enough people had noticed. The change wasn't dramatic. There was no public apology, no ceremonial acknowledgement of past wrongs. The culture of FOB Crescent didn't shift overnight, but in small, incremental ways, respect began to replace contempt. Officers started consulting Rachel during mission planning phases rather than after decisions had already been made. Soldiers stopped making comments when she walked past. The table in the chow hall where she sat was no longer empty. Rachel didn't change her approach. She continued submitting detailed reports, flagging potential risks, recommending caution when others pushed for speed. But now, more often than not, her input was considered rather than dismissed. And when missions succeeded because of precautions she had recommended, the success was noted, even if her name wasn't always attached to it. She learned to accept this. Recognition didn't have to be public to be real. Respect didn't have to be loud to matter. 4 months after the battalion operation, Rachel was promoted to staff sergeant. The ceremony was small, conducted in the operations center with only the immediate command staff present. The major, who had initially dismissed her concerns but later authorized the engineering assessment, presented her with the new rank insignia. "Sergeant Kern," he said, "your attention to detail and commitment to thorough analysis have prevented multiple operational failures over the past 6 months. That's the kind of professionalism we need in our NCO Corps." Rachel accepted the promotion with the same quiet composure she brought to everything else. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You earned it." She had, through months of mockery, dismissal, and isolation, She had continued doing the work correctly. She had documented every concern, submitted every analysis, flagged every risk, and when the inevitable failures came, when the patterns she had identified proved accurate, the record had been there, not as vindication, not as weapon, but as evidence of professional competence that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. That evening, Rachel sat at her desk long after the promotion ceremony had ended, looking at the new insignia in her hand. She thought about the word that had defined her for so long, coward. She thought about all the times she had been called hesitant, overcautious, afraid. She thought about the soldiers who had mocked her, the officers who had dismissed her, the entire culture that had treated thorough analysis as a character flaw, and she thought about the convoys that had returned safely because routes were changed, the operations that had succeeded because risks were mitigated, the soldiers who were alive because someone had taken the time to think before acting. They had called it cowardice, but cowardice was never what it had been. It had been responsibility. It had been professionalism. It had been the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping people alive by preventing mistakes before they became casualties. Rachel placed the new rank insignia in her pocket and returned to her work. There was another mission brief to review, another route to analyze, another set of risks to identify and document. The work never stopped. The need for thorough, careful, professional assessment never diminished. And now, finally, she could do that work without having to fight for the right to be heard. The label hadn't been formally retracted. No one had apologized for the months of mockery and dismissal. But in the operations center of FOB Crescent, among the soldiers who had learned what happened when caution was ignored and what succeeded when it was respected, the word had lost its power. Rachel Kern was no longer the coward. She was the sergeant who kept people alive. And in the end, that was the only label that mattered.